Thank you for the invitation. We have heard a couple of presentations on blind spots of modern architecture today, and I'm going to add another one, the underground. The underground is a blind spot of modern architecture and urbanism. Architecture and urbanism are almost exclusively concerned with above-ground construction, while the underground in analogy, subterranean infrastructure and below-ground construction are predominantly considered the terrain of engineering. However, before pursuing this hypothesis, I will briefly address the question of why architecture and urbanism should include the underground at all. Architecture and the city have occupied the underground since their earliest formation. Foundations and basements came first, followed in the 19th century by initial network infrastructures like gas, water, sewers, electricity, and eventually underground transport systems. While most of these networks were almost purely technical installations, with the event of underground traffic infrastructures, the occupation of the underground and the city's entire logic of circulation and spatial order changed. For most of its existence, the city used to be a construction with only one plane of reference, ground level or the streets. Then subway systems introduced a second plane of transport below. The underground acquired a public dimension. The city increasingly came to be organized in layers. The streets were no longer the only system of organization and order. Not only did this bring fundamental change to the city structure, it also changed the way we use and perceive cities and likewise architecture. To illustrate this change, I will start in New York City. At the beginning of the 20th century, New York developed several national and regional underground train lines and stations and a subway system that opened in 1904. As Manhattan was densely occupied and land prices were high, these train stations seldomly came alone. What you can see here is the Hudson Terminal from 1909, a hybrid building complex, partly architecture, partly infrastructure, consisting above ground of two almost identical towers that were connected by sky bridges at level 4 and 17, and an underground train station with 3 levels, a public concourse, and shops below ground. Besides this example of vertical integration, there are also numerous examples of horizontal assemblage of regular subway stations and adjacent buildings. The second underground level of transport brought significant change to connected buildings, the basements of which held an access and an exit and therefore no longer were a dead end. The first level of these buildings acquired similar functions as ground floor level, or you could say the first underground level turned into a second ground floor level. At a large scale, the city was no longer necessarily a continuous sequence of spaces defined by the street network, but rather an archipelago in which the islands could be discovered and connected in almost any arbitrary sequence, eventually without touching ground. The two building complexes shown before are two of the earliest constructions with an underground entrance served by train or subway station, even preceding the famous Grand Central Station complex that opened in 1913. Yet, other than Grand Central Station complex, which found its place in architectural history, these two buildings, like most of their type from New York or any other city, have not. I could have also started this story in Paris or Berlin or with one of the numerous cities that during the second half of the 20th century, continuing in the 21st, acquired a second underground level of transport. Large cities like Tokyo or Shanghai, but also smaller cities like Montreal, Stockholm or Zurich, and also Stuttgart. The spread of the second underground level proliferated after World War II, when the so-called second level either elevated or underground, referring to the streets as first level, was promoted as the universal formula for traffic planning issues. With the spread of the car and parking facilities, the second level also expanded beyond the routes of train lines. If the history of modern architecture considered architecture to be construction above ground level, this was also true for urbanism. From its invention towards the end of the 19th century until today, urbanism mainly focused on above-ground construction, either because it largely ignored the underground or because it distinctively argued for a separation between architecture and traffic infrastructure and in analogy between above and below-ground construction. Both attitudes originated in the critique of technocratic city planning and the city of the late 19th century. One fraction of the urbanism movement that eventually led to the functionalist city of Siam thought the rationalization of the city simply did not go far enough. They embraced the so-called traffic primate, which was first articulated by Ildefonse Cerda in his general theory of urbanization from 1867, yet also already prominent in early 19th century theories from the École des Pensées Chaussées. Along with the promotion of functional zoning and the separation of functions where necessary, they also promoted the vertical separation of traffic planes and pedestrian, car, and train traffic. Architecture and traffic infrastructure were to be integrated, yet elevated and lifted out of the ground to overcome the underground, which was associated with the city of the late 19th century. The other fraction that was initiated by Camillo Sitte's book, Der Städtebau nach seinen künstlerischen Grundsätzen, which also gave the name to the movement, dismissed rational planning and foremost the primate of traffic, focusing their critique on the spatial uniformity of rationalized street networks and urban space. Instead, they referred to the historical city as a model for spatial organization. Dismissing traffic as a guiding principle also meant, in the end, to dismiss the integration of architecture and traffic infrastructure, claiming the autonomy of architecture. Positions of urbanism that integrated the underground and underground infrastructure remained a rare exception. So if I'm referring to the metaphor of the blind spot, it is not claimed that something, in this case the underground, was not noticed at all, even though underground structures are mostly invisible from the street perspective, or that someone, in this case planners or architects, were not aware of them, but rather, like Jan Philipp Reetsma recently suggested, to refer to a structural blindness that in this case largely originated in the labor division between architects and engineers and the implicit distinction between architecture and engineering, or architecture and public works. When after Second World War the functionalist city model became the focus point of critique, the reactions from the field of urbanism and the attitudes towards traffic infrastructure and the spatial disposition continued to follow a similar logic. On one side, there were attempts to reform the functionalist city. The structuralist Team 10 or the megastructure movement gave up functional zoning, yet the preference for the integration of infrastructure and architecture remained, and with it also the preference for the elevation of infrastructure or the elevated second level. Antithetical to this were the attempts to propose a so-called traditional city that was partly based on the spatial model of the historical city and partly on the city of the late 19th century. Concepts like the traditional city from Collage City or the claim for the reconstruction of the European city, written with a large E, which found its origins in Brussels. To enable this model, the concept called for a spatial separation between architecture and infrastructure and above and below ground construction. If urbanism was restricted to superstructure, then the invention of the so-called Urbanisme souterrain in Paris in 1933, a movement that found its peak in the 1960s, further confirms this hypothesis. A mirror image of urbanisme souterrain, was the engineer's urbanism, focusing almost exclusively on subterranean space and the technical dimension of the substructure of the city. The connection with the existing city remained relatively abstract, even though one of the concept's premises was the claim to be a strategy that allows both preservation and modernization. Urbanisme souterrain remained relatively short-lived also because it was incompatible with the other urbanisms, especially with the preservationist concept of the historical city that found its conceptual identity at the beginning of the 20th century as the antithesis of infrastructure-based forms of urbanization. Given the fact that subway systems enabled the preservation of the spatial organization of several historical and 19th century cities, cities like Paris or Berlin and even Manhattan, renders this circumstance quite ironic. Underground planning subsequently developed into a highly specialized branch of engineering with its own very technical discourse, highly specialized magazines, and very close ties to the construction industry. Even the growing interest in infrastructure and the city as a networked entity that started in the 1980s, caused by the end of the infrastructural ideal and the emergence of its successor, splintering urbanism, which, amongst other things, stated the inseparable, increasingly hybrid nature of architecture and infrastructure, so far did not change this. So, to sum up, modern architecture and urbanism largely either wanted to overcome the underground and therefore ignored it, or ignored it to claim the presumed autonomy of architecture and urbanism, or to frame it differently, urbanism as architecture. In consequence, architecture and the city are typically reduced to their physiognomy, leaving large parts of their real anatomy and all related dimensions misrepresented and misunderstood. Thank you.